Magic. All right, it's great to be here. Thank you so much. I'm going to be talking about a report that came out from the academies in about 2014, I believe, if I'm remembering the date right. It's the result of one of our consensus studies. This is when we get a lot of smart people in the room and talk about a particular problem. The charge to this committee was to identify and characterize existing sort of integrated STEM approaches, to review the evidence for impact on various outcomes, and then set a priority set of research questions to advance our understanding. So I'm going to blow through some of the major ideas from this study. I think even though in this study we didn't look necessarily at computation or computational thinking specifically, some of the lessons about integration I think will apply and will catalyze some really interesting conversations. We had a great committee. We love our committees. They're all volunteer every time they do it, and I want to recognize a number of people in the room who I think have participated in our committees or helped our committees. We really, really appreciate that. And there are at least 3 or 4 active committee members right now. So one of the arguments for the importance of integrated STEM, and I want to point out that just saying the acronym STEM doesn't automatically assume integration. STEM is just an acronym for the disciplines. You have to really be thinking about intentional integration to get there. One of the arguments for it is that that's how it looks in the real world when people are practicing these disciplines. There are connections between them. But that means there's a lot of claims made about integrated STEM education or integrated activities, and part of the purpose of the study was to get underneath those claims, the hand waving about the magic that happens when you engage kids in integrated activities. How do we get underneath what's really happening? So one of the things the committee did, I know that you can't see all the details necessarily here. This is in the report, which is available free online, but it's to lay out to try to understand, okay, if we're going to understand what's happening in an integrated activity, how do we break it down? How do we sort of identify the components and understand how they're related? We want to understand the broad goals, because a lot of programs, especially at that time, that claimed to be integrated STEM had really lofty goals about everything they were going to do. Then get underneath that, wait, what are they specifically claiming on the outcomes their effect that will build to those goals? Then really articulate the nature and scope of integration, and I will tell you this is a place where a lot of projects were weak, that they didn't really describe what they were doing or what they meant by integration, and also describe the implementation. So these were just ways that the committee laid out, how can we even understand what's going on in the landscape of what's claiming to be integrated STEM experiences? So some of the commonly used approaches, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, problem-based, project-based, design-based, some of the common features, the student-centeredness in a whole variety of ways it's student-centered, the small group work, and the teachers as facilitators or guides. Not sage on the stage, guide on the side. I will point out that those 3 aren't exclusive to interdisciplinary work. Those happen within disciplines. That's sort of the push in general for good pedagogy. The last one, that the problems or projects or design or the focus or stimulus also isn't unique to integration, but putting them all together is sometimes unique. So what's the potential of integrated STEM? What did the committee find was the potential of integrated STEM? Well, it can enhance learning in each of the disciplines, and that's often the claim. So for example, if you're talking about computational thinking and you say, oh, well, we may not be able to just have it in one place in the curriculum, we don't have space, we'll just put it throughout and it'll happen. So that's one of the arguments, that we enhance learning in a discipline by doing integrated STEM. We're going to help students understand the connections between them, so how science and engineering are mutually supporting and enhancing, how math is involved in them, how computational thinking might play a role. One of the other claims is that it increases interest in STEM, and that goes to a lot of these features of really student-centered, you get a lot of interaction, it's meaningful problems or meaningful projects, so it's going to increase interest. The notion is that to achieve these outcomes, the learning experiences need to be designed with particular outcomes in mind. Now, I'm pretty certain that you guys wouldn't be in this room with the work that you're doing if you hadn't done this, but it was amazing in looking at the literature out there how many projects did not do this. So they made claims about the outcomes they were aiming for, but it wasn't clear that they'd backed up in a systematic way to have their design map to those outcomes. So some of the lessons about thinking about design when you're developing integrated STEM experiences to make the integration explicit. And I'm going to unpack that just a little bit more. To attend to students' disciplinary knowledge while you're also working in this integrated context. Pay attention to the social aspects of learning. I'm not going to dig into that one because that's not just unique to this context, but Just remember, you can't assume that the interpersonal dynamics are going to just happen. You got to support kids to be doing that in a productive way, just as well as engaging in the disciplines and in the problem productively. And consider how to support the development of interest. As this is one of the things that we think can happen through these integrated experiences, we actually have to attend to how we're supporting it. So a little more on the explicit piece of it. Simply presenting a real-world context doesn't mean that kids are going to see the connections. An expert will probably see them. The person who designed them knows they're there, but the perspective of the novice learner is really important. They may not see it at all. They may not understand the connections. So the teachers and facilitators need to make them explicitly. When we, threw this projectile here and we talked about how it was going, this is why we're talking about then an angle of the motion. These are the equations that are represented in this graph. You have to be explicit about the connections, even though the expert knows them, that this is what you're uncovering for the novice. So how do you build that in? And that's between different forms of representation, from one context to another, or connections between disciplines. You also, if you want kids to develop outcomes in particular disciplines, you've got to attend to that disciplinary knowledge. This is a delicate dance. So students need disciplinary knowledge to be able to use it in the context of integration, but they also need to be signaled that the disciplinary knowledge they have is relevant. So kids may have knowledge of some mathematics, and in a science context, they don't even think they should apply it. So part of what you need to do in design is to figure out, how do I need to signal to them this needs to happen? They also may not revise their understanding based on the integrated experiences. They need some explicit signaling. Hey, let's go back and revisit what we knew about this concept in science or this concept in math. So I think this raises a lot of questions when we're talking about computational thinking and integrating it across the disciplines. What are the elements of computational thinking that we think we're building outside of what we're doing in the discipline? I personally, this is not in the report, this is my belief or my question, how much of computational thinking really is discipline-free? Like, how much can it be abstracted? I think that's an interesting and open question. So the committee also thought about, how do we implement? There's a bunch of issues in the K-12 setting we know about. We've highlighted some of them. Educator expertise, I think we really have to emphasize. There are also issues in informal settings that relate to this. Educator expertise or facilitator expertise is one of them, but also time, resources, space, things like that. I won't go into that. I wanted to get into the research recommendations. Some of these, I believe, are being taken up in the STEM Plus C program. So some of these are on the way to being addressed, but I think it's good to think about them. One was just highlighting the good qualities of excellent research here. You need rich description of the intervention, good kinds of designs, control or comparison groups. The field could benefit from common framework for describing interventions and the nature of the interdisciplinary piece of it. It was incredibly hard for the committee to get their arms around all of the things that people claimed were integrated STEM. I've got to say that the problem's only going to get worse if you're doing STEM plus C. So we just got to get some sort of commonality in the language that we're using and how we're understanding the nature of integration. Also, avoid the notion that integrated STEM is good for everything. You need to be more careful, especially if you're doing research on it, to delineate the impact on achievement, interest, identity, map the particular outcomes and what your logic model is for why this kind of integration is going to lead to them. There's a need to look at long-term impacts on interest and identity, tons of claims about what these kinds of experiences do long-term, but we didn't find a lot of empirical evidence. Some recommendations about design and implementation and evaluation. It's really that logic model notion. Really be explicit about how the kinds of things, the kinds of experiences you're creating for learners are leading to the outcomes that you're interested in and how. And that's really important, and in much of the research that the committee was able to find at that time, I want to emphasize, just didn't do this enough. And that's it. So all of our reports are available in free PDF online at www.nap.edu. You can see more on the board there, and please, I'm happy to be contacted about the work, and I can make these slides available. Thank you.